Are you all with us so far in the lecture? Good. Right. So I'll now ask Bill Jarvis to read the first question from the traveller to his host, Nichiren Daishonin.
There was once a traveller who, staying as a guest at the house of another, spoke these words in sorrow. Beginning in recent years and continuing even today, we find unusual happenings in the heavens, strange occurrences on earth, famine and pestilence, all filling every corner of the empire and spreading throughout the land. Oxen and horses lie dead in the streets. The bones of the dead crowd the highways. Over half the population has already been carried off by death, and there is not a person who does not grieve for some member of his family. During this time there have been some who, putting all their faith in the sharp sword of the Buddha Amida, intone the name of the Lord of the Western Paradise. Others, believing that the Buddha Yakushi will heal all ills, recite the sutra that describes him as the Tathagata of the Eastern region. Some, putting their trust in the passage in the Lotus Sutra that says, "Illness shall vanish at once, no old age, no death," pay homage to the wonderful words of that sutra. Others, citing the passage in the Ninno Sutra that reads, "The 7 difficulties vanish, the 7 blessings at once appear," conduct ceremonies at which 100 preachers expound the sutra at 100 places. There are those who, following the secret teachings of the Shingon sect, carry out prayers by filling 5 jars with water. And others who devote themselves entirely to Zen-type meditation, seeing the emptiness of all phenomena as clearly as the moon. Some write out the titles of the 7 guardian spirits and paste them on 1,000 gates. Others paint pictures of the 5 mighty bodhisattvas and hang them over 10,000 doorways. And still others pray to the gods of heaven and the deities of earth in ceremonies conducted at the 4 corners of the capital and on the 4 boundaries of the nation. The ruler of the nation and the governors of provinces, taking pity on the plight of the common people, make certain that government is carried out in a benevolent manner. But despite all these efforts, they merely exhaust their bodies and minds. Famine and disease rage more fiercely than ever. Beggars are everywhere in sight, and the dead fill our eyes. Corpses pile up in mounds like observation platforms. Dead bodies lie side by side like planks in a bridge. If we look about, we find that the sun and moon continue to move in their accustomed orbits, and the 5 planets follow their proper courses. The 3 treasures of Buddhism continue to exist, and the period of 100 reigns, during which the Bodhisattva Hachiman vowed to protect the nation, has not yet run out. Then why is it that the world has already fallen into decline and that the laws of the state have come to an end? What mistake is causing this? What error has brought this about?
Thank you very much indeed. So this first question, as you see, sets out fairly briefly but very dramatically the intense sufferings of the people at that time. And it shows how both people and their leaders were groping about wildly in ignorance and darkness, trying to find a solution. But they failed. Nothing was effective. Their prayers, their rituals, their ceremonies, carried out by all the various religious beliefs in Japan at that time, were to no avail. And disasters continued to occur, one after another. So the setting, as I said earlier, is Japan. But a similar situation could be found in many other parts of the world from time to time, ever since those days in the 13th century to the present day. This is Mappo, just as Shakyamuni predicted 3,000 years ago. Exact. The Buddha's prediction has come true. So in the sense that this is Mappa, of course, this is also the world, isn't it? West as well as East, and today as well as 700 years ago. The question at the end is so clear, isn't it? A question which is in the hearts of thousands, perhaps millions of people today. A question which lots of people hide from, feeling baffled and apathetic by the situation they see around them. Why is it that the world has already fallen into decline? We're doing our best, and the laws of the state have come to an end. They have no value in these situations. What mistake is causing this? What error has brought this about? So this question sets the stage for the whole of this gosho and leads to Nichiren Daishonin explaining in the greatest depth the reasons for this situation and how it can be solved. So I'd like now, together with you, to look at Japan as it was now, at that time, and then to look at what the rest of the world was like at that time. And finally, to look at the world a little more today. So the scenes that the traveller describes are absolutely accurate, in no way exaggerated. There are plenty of contemporary accounts written at the time which are still extant. Perhaps some of you have read a book called Children of Hachiman. If you haven't, if you don't mind something that's a bit bloodthirsty, it's worth reading. This is a novel which has been very carefully based on Japanese history and describes the situation in Japan a little earlier than this particular time. We're concerned here with the 13th century, and that novel is concerned with something, the history of Japan about 70 years earlier. But it gives you a very graphic picture of what it must have been like to live in those days. Perhaps some of you have read accounts, contemporary accounts, of the Black Death, the great plague that swept across Europe in the 14th century, and then also later in the 15th century. Thousands and thousands died, and the bodies were literally, as this gosho says, piled high in the streets. People died so fast there was no time to give them normal burials. And I believe that places like Blackheath and other open spaces in London that are still not built on were the mass burial grounds at the time of the plague. But not only pestilence was afflicting them. As we've already heard, there were storms, typhoons, droughts, fires, tremendous earthquakes that destroyed up to half or more of the buildings in towns and cities. And added to that, of course, inevitably there was great social upheaval. First of all, historically, it was a time of upheaval because, as I said earlier, the emperor had lost power and the samurais had taken control of the land. And there was a great deal of fear amongst many at this military government and what they might do next. The priests of many of the sects were treated like gods, totally authoritarian in their rule. And they were, of course, bolstered by the natural superstitions of people of those days. The temples themselves of many sects were immensely rich, very similar to the monasteries in this land. Their income was derived from their land and property. And because, above all things, far above, I'm afraid, their faith, they wished to defend this material benefit. The absurd situation arose where the temples organized armies of monks, warrior monks, whose job was to protect the estates and land of each temple. Needless to say, the temple authorities would intrigue, of course, with the government, whoever they thought would be the ruling power, and make sure that they stayed in their favor. This chaos, resulting from both social upheaval and natural disaster, meant that there was no organized work or labor. There was poverty everywhere. People could only live by stealing. Most of them were starving. Their houses had collapsed through fire or flood, and even at times there were outbreaks of cannibalism. The people had totally lost the will to live. And as I said earlier, escapist religions were playing on the fears and superstitions of the people in order to give them some thing to hide their heads in. So when Nichiren Daishonin answers this question a little later, which we shall discuss next time, he relates all these terrible happenings to the teaching in Buddhism known as the 3 calamities and 7 disasters. These were taught by Shakyamuni Buddha originally in a sutra called the Yakushi Sutra, and in also many other sutras they are mentioned. These are the calamities and disasters that would arise in the end, quite inevitably, if people were following the wrong teachings. Now, the 3 calamities are war, inflation, and epidemics. Huge, widespread epidemics. And the disasters are foreign invasion, pestilence, civil war, unseasonable storms, unseasonable droughts, changes in the heavens, and solar eclipses. The 3 calamities and the 7 disasters. So, of course, Nichiren Daishonin's paper was aimed to try to make people understand this and to mend their ways. He castigated the priests who were condoning violence in forming armies of warrior monks. And he pointed out that the teachings of Shakyamuni, just as Shakyamuni had said himself, would not be effective in the time of Mappo. So, looking now at the rest of the world, we can see how Shakyamuni's predictions of the age of Mappo do not, of course, apply only to Japan or only to the Far East or Asia, but they apply to the whole world. And it's amazing to think that Shakyamuni predicted this so accurately, such a long, long, long time ago. The 13th to the 15th century was really a turning point in human history. And a turning point, most important of all to us, in its religious history. And of course, religion is fundamental to man. So it reflects everything and creates everything in society in that sense. And as we said earlier, unless religion can give proof of its power in everyday life, it can't be the true religion. This is what Nichiren Daishonin was constantly pointing out. So not only in Shakyamuni's Buddhism, but also in the other great religions of the Middle East and the West, this period was one when they became formalized and ritualized and authoritarian. They became gradually, from this point on, separated from the people because of this authoritarianism, the fact that people had to approach the ultimate object of devotion through the priest in order to gain benefit. Shakyamuni had predicted this, of course, for the age of Zoho, the age in the second period of 1,000 years after he died, when he said that his pure law that he had taught would lose its impact and help to the people because of this ritualization and ceremonial. And at that time, right through to the time of this gosho, the temples were places purely and simply of ritual, where the people could no longer take part in the daily practice of Buddhism. But in the West too, a little later, from the 12th century onwards, great cathedrals were being built, and religious dogma was taking a strong place in religion. And rituals and a system of rule was being established both in Christianity and to some extent also in Islam. The religion was losing its hold on the people. It was only the very beginning in the West, but it was definitely happening slowly. Also, there was great conflict, of course, in the West within religions, as well as in Japan. At about that time, there was the 100 Years' War, which was entirely a religious war, though, of course, it had political overtones. And by the 15th century, King Henry VIII was plotting to reject the Pope and Rome and establish his own church. And during that period also, such reformers as Luther and Calvin were at work. War particularly was rife, and these wars most of the time had a religious reason to them. The Crusades continued on and off for 200 years. There was immense bloodshed in the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, and many other wars. War was beginning to become a habit. It was being ingrained deep in the karma of nations. And the cause and effect of this, of course, culminated in the two world wars, 1914, 1839-45, when 20 or even some say 30 million lives were lost. In the Far East at that time, the Mongolians were ravaging the whole of Asia under Genghis Khan. There was a great deal of slaughter and brutality. Islam was beginning to expand its movement after the Crusades into Europe itself. And at this time, pestilence hit Europe horribly. As I said already, enormous numbers of people died from the Black Death. A third of the population of Europe, indeed, is said to have died at that time. These figures are unbelievable and difficult to visualize. At the same time, in Europe, from the 13th to the 15th century, there was very icy weather. The Baltic was frozen from coast to coast. The Thames was frozen over on a number of occasions. The harvests were very poor, and there was a great deal of poverty and lack of sustenance as a result. In England, like many other countries in Europe and the world, various power groups were just beginning to form. And these would lead, of course, in England, in the end, to the Civil War and the beheading of King Charles I and the end of the divine right of kings. At the same time, as all these horrors were happening, transport and communications were improving, weren't they? The world was being discovered, from Marco Polo to Columbus and Drake. And through these communications improving, the great religions of the world were beginning to become aware of each other, which they hadn't really been before. So really between the 13th and the 15th century, the existing order that had been established for thousands of years was beginning to show signs of decline and collapse. Of course, we can see that now looking back, but it would have been very difficult for anyone to see at that time. And out of this swamp, just as Shakyamuni predicted, the white lotus appeared in the form of Nichiren Daishonin and Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. So today still, of course, the 3 calamities and the 7 disasters are very much at work, aren't they? Despite the horrors of those 2 world wars when so many, many millions of people were killed, there are still wars everywhere. And as I said earlier, the nuclear race continues. It's a form of insanity, isn't it? Pestilence still appears, especially in the undeveloped lands. But in Europe, instead of pestilence, we've replaced it by mental sickness. So that although medicine is so advanced, and the traditional, as it were, forms of sickness have begun to decline, they have been replaced by other forms of sickness, especially mental illness. Earthquakes occur across the world. There are incredible storms and hurricanes, fortunately not in this part of Europe. There's been a ghastly drought in Africa, now for more than 2 years. Africa, as you know, is a place where there is a religious vacuum as a result of the destruction of the tribal religions through Christianity, and the result now of the decline and decay of Christianity itself. 2/3 of the world is really not eating enough, and 1/3 of the world is below the sustenance level. Even today, the changes in the heavens continue to occur. As you know, the air is filled with pollution. In Japan, in the bad areas, you can't see a clear sun during the day, nor the moon at night. There are parts of America that are the same. I'm glad to say this is better now in England. But far worse than that, one reads reports from scientists about, for example, the mass use of aerosols changing the outer atmosphere and the belt of ozone, which is so important from the point of view of the sun's rays. What will happen in the next 5 or 10 years or 20 years if man goes on with its technology uncontrolled and based on utter ignorance and stupidity? So we really are today asking that same question, aren't we, in our hearts? What mistake is causing this? What error has brought this about? Often we complain about our politicians, our leaders. We say there is no such thing as a great leader in the world, and everyone really bemoans their fate. But in actuality, it's not the fault of the leaders. They're as ignorant as everyone else. The fault is through the wrong teachings, the wrong philosophies, and the fact that the ultimate truth has not yet been established in the world. So our leaders are as powerless and as impotent as everyone else. Nichiren Daishonin makes that clear in that short extract that I'll ask Bill to read again.
The ruler of the nation and the governors of provinces, taking pity on the plight of the common people, make certain that government is carried out in a benevolent manner. But despite all these efforts, they merely exhaust their bodies and minds.
So the RISSHO ANKOKU RON was to try to shake people out of their apathy, out of the traditional ruts that they'd got into, to shake them out of their superstitious beliefs, and to try to make them see the truth. And of course our task is to do that in the future. I won't read all the way through the various religious acts that were being carried out in Japan at the time of these disasters. But of course they were being carried out with the utmost sincerity by the people. But they were useless. Today, one could say the same. There are great religions, but they seem powerless to prevent the world sliding towards destruction. And indeed, they seem powerless even in certain cases to hold the people. The last paragraph I'll ask Bill to read again, because this is important from this point of view.
If we look about, we find that the sun and moon continue to move in their accustomed orbits, and the 5 planets follow their proper courses. The 3 treasures of Buddhism continue to exist, and the period of 100 reigns, during which the Bodhisattva Hachiman vowed to protect the nation, has not yet run out. Then why is it that the world has already fallen into decline, and that the laws of the state have come to an end? What mistake is causing this? What error has brought this about?
The Nichiren Daishonin is saying, if you look at things from a broader point of view, everything seems to be the same. The seasons come and go. The moon is there. The sun is there. The stars are there. And he says the 3 treasures of Buddhism continue to exist. He means by that the established Buddhist sects in Japan are there just as they were previously. Just as we can say that Christianity and Islam and Judaism are all here today. The earth hasn't suddenly turned 40 degrees. We're still on the same axis, still revolving in the same way. Yet this disaster and suffering is happening everywhere. So he's saying that neither religion or, as we could say today, science nor technology are proving that they can cure the situation in which the world is in. Neither, for that matter, can politics or economics or social sciences. On their own, they're powerless. They can only attack the evil on the surface, but they can't get to the root of it. So I often like to quote that earthy guidance of Mr. Izumi's in Japan, when he said that if your baby's ill with diarrhea, it's no good slapping a plaster on its bottom and thinking that you've cured it. You've got to discover the root cause of the sickness. Many diseases, as I said, are being cured by immunization, inoculation, and so on, but others appearing in their place. People of goodwill are trying their very utmost, but they're failing, and this is most apparent when we look at the world state. We can't overcome the 3 calamities and the 7 disasters by technology or science, because these 3 calamities and 7 disasters arise from men's hearts, and therefore the only way to overcome them is through changing the hearts of human beings. The relationship between social chaos and natural disasters is very plain to see. If you like to really make a study of it in history, you'll find it's most apparent. All life is connected. Of course, Buddhism teaches the great principle of Esho Funi, the inseparability of man and his environment. And that environment includes what the old-fashioned people used to call the heavens, as well as the earth. If man's heart is shaking, so everything else in his environment, including the climate, will be shaking as well. I often remember how when Gandhi was assassinated, when that news came through over the radio, this country was covered with a most eerie yellow light. And when the radio by satellite announced the assassination of President Kennedy of the United States, there were immense flashes of lightning across the skies, certainly in Sussex where I was living. These things are not by chance, but we're so ignorant and stupid these days that we don't connect them. If we were an aborigine in the Australian desert, we would understand it totally. The gosho says, another one, on attaining Buddhahood, if the minds of the people are impure, their land is also impure. But if their minds are pure, so is their land. There are not two lands, pure or impure in themselves. The difference lies solely in the good or evil of our minds. The problem is this duality in man. Even those who will say now they're yearning for peace will go out and kill for the sake of their country or whatever. Our future depends, doesn't it, on the number of people who can open their eyes to the truth. And who is going to open their eyes to the truth except the followers of Nichiren Daishonin, basing their actions on this gosho? This is our task as bodhisattvas of the earth. This is what Nichiren Daishonin is hoping that without fail we'll achieve. And we must do it, mustn't we? So I was born long before most of you, and when I was a very little boy, it was just after the end of World War I. And I clearly remember the effect of that war on my family and friends. The grief still hadn't entirely passed. And the confusion still existed and culminated in the general strike of 1926. The best of an entire generation was destroyed in that war. Millions upon millions of young men throughout the whole of Europe and other parts of the world. And when I left school in 1938, already the practice air raid sirens were being tested in London and elsewhere in the UK. And like others here, I then spent 5 years at war. And I know how messy and disgusting it can be. And yet, day after day, if you watch your television, war is still being glorified. Almost every single night, there is some film or some program glorifying war. Maybe my generation can look at it and say that's a load of my eye. But I don't know what the younger generation may say and think in their hearts. This is a terrible thing. And this is the karma of nations, that they continue to turn a blind eye to war in this way. So I really ask you, just to conclude this, that we none of us spare ourselves. We're only a small force yet, but every day we're growing. We have to win this battle, because there is nothing that has the power of the Gohonzon and Nam-myoho Renge Kyo in this world that we live in. And we have to spread it to people and to save this world as it's meant to be saved. So I'm not depressed in the least about the future. The very reason for the bodhisattvas of the earth appearing, the very reason for the Gohonzon being inscribed 700 years ago, was so that the world would not be destroyed and would continue its proper workings in the universe itself. So I know that we'll all go together and win that battle. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.